Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a look at Freedom House's Freedom in the World 2025 report. And, well, let's just say it paints a pretty bleak picture of global freedom.
It really does. The report, which assesses freedom in 195 countries and 13 territories, shows that global freedom has declined for the 19th consecutive year.
19 years in a row. That's a long time.
It is. And the numbers are pretty stark. 60 countries experienced setbacks in political rights and civil liberties, while only 34 showed improvement.
So more than twice as many countries going backwards as forwards. That's concerning.
It's very concerning. This decline impacts a staggering 40% of the world's population.
Wow, that's a huge chunk of humanity.
Yeah.
And what are some of the key factors driving this decline?
Well, one of the most worrying trends is the increasing use of violence, particularly during elections.
Elections are supposed to be about the peaceful transfer of power, not violence.
You would think so, but in 2024, out of 66 countries holding elections, a disturbing 27 witnessed violence.
More than a third. That's really alarming. What kind of violence are we talking about here?
These attacks targeted candidates' polling places and even voters themselves.
So even the act of participating in democracy is becoming dangerous in some parts of the world.
Exactly. And while elections in democracies were generally fair, authoritarian regimes used them as a tool for control. Take Tunisia, for example. President Kais Saied's crackdown on dissent culminated in his re-election in October, but only after his regime disqualified most of his opponents.
So a win for the incumbent, but a loss for democracy itself.
Unfortunately, yes. Another example is Venezuela, where authoritarian leader Nicolas Maduro tried to sideline opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. While this backfired, it resulted in violence and intimidation, ultimately leading to a disputed election victory for Maduro.
It's a reminder that even attempts to resist authoritarian tactics can lead to further instability and suffering.
Absolutely. But amidst these troubling trends, there are a few glimmers of hope. Bhutan, for instance, transitioned from partly free to free after holding elections that solidified its democratic reforms.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Not entirely. Indian Kashmir also saw its status improve, moving from not free to partly free following the return of elections. While these elections don't erase the damage caused by the Indian government's previous actions, they do mark a step towards restoring political representation for the local population.
It seems like every step towards free and fair elections is a victory worth celebrating, even if the journey to full democracy is long and complex.
Indeed. Now let's shift gears to another major factor impacting global freedom: armed conflict. A staggering 20% of countries and territories scored a dismal 0 out of 4 on Freedom House's physical security indicator, highlighting the devastating consequences of war on basic rights and security.
It's hard to imagine what life must be like in those places.
The ongoing civil war in Myanmar, sparked by the 2021 military coup, offers a grim example. Thousands of civilians have been killed, millions displaced, and the junta continues to intensify its campaign of repression. Beyond its borders, the conflict's impact is felt as criminal groups exploit the instability, impacting regional and even global security.
It's a tragic reminder that the costs of war extend far beyond the immediate battlefield.
Precisely. Another conflict with far-reaching consequences is the war in the Gaza Strip. In 2024, it surpassed the one-year mark, resulting in immense suffering for the Palestinian population. The systematic obstruction of humanitarian aid and destruction of civilian infrastructure have created a dire humanitarian crisis.
It sounds like a completely untenable situation.
It is. And the ripple effects of the conflict extended across the Middle East, embroiling Hamas allies in Lebanon and beyond, resulting in further displacement and suffering.
So armed conflicts are not only impacting freedom in the countries where they occur, but also spilling over into neighboring regions, creating a domino effect of instability.
Yes, unfortunately, that's the case in many instances. Now, turning our attention to a different type of threat to freedom, we see a concerning trend of countries transitioning from partly free to not free. These nations highlight how authoritarian regimes are using increasingly sophisticated tactics to stifle dissent and tighten their control.
That sounds ominous. Can you give us an example?
Thailand is a prime example. Despite a promising display of democratic support in the 2023 elections, the country regressed to not free as unelected forces reasserted their power. The Constitutional Court disbanded the winning opposition party and removed the prime minister, effectively undermining the people's will.
So even when the people speak through the ballot box, their voices can still be silenced.
That's the danger we're seeing in a growing number of countries. Kuwait offers another stark example. After an opposition-controlled parliament was elected in April, the emir dissolved it and assumed sole rule through his appointed cabinet. This effectively stripped citizens of their political voice, leading to Kuwait's downgrade to not free.
It's disheartening to see democratic progress reverse so swiftly.
Indeed, Niger, following a military coup in 2023, also saw a decline in freedom as the junta consolidated its power. The regime dissolved local councils, suspended media outlets, and denied due process to supporters of the ousted civilian leadership.
Seems like a classic case of a coup promising stability but delivering only more repression.
Sadly, that's often the case. And finally, Tanzania joined the ranks of not-free countries after years of declining rights and liberties. The authorities used mass detention against protesters and continue to displace indigenous communities, demonstrating a blatant disregard for human rights.
These examples paint a bleak picture of how quickly freedom can erode even in countries that have shown signs of progress.
They do. And these regressive trends highlight a broader global pattern: intensified assaults on fundamental rights, particularly targeting freedom of expression and the rule of law.
Okay, let's unpack this further. What does this assault on freedom of expression look like in practice?
The report reveals a chilling statistic: the number of countries and territories with a score of 0 out of 4 for media freedom, indicating a near-total absence of independent media, has nearly tripled since 2005.
That's a dramatic increase.
It is. And in 2024 alone, attacks on the media were documented in over 120 countries and territories.
Wow, that's more than half the countries in the world.
It is. These attacks range from censorship and imprisonment of journalists to physical harassment and violence.
It's clear that those who dare to speak truth to power are facing increasing danger around the world.
Absolutely. Hong Kong, under Beijing's tightening grip, offers a chilling example. The national security law has effectively criminalized any form of dissent, including independent journalism. The ongoing trial of Jimmy Lai, former publisher of the Apple Daily, and the sentencing of pro-democracy activists highlight the law's sweeping reach and its impact on fundamental freedoms.
It sounds like Hong Kong is rapidly losing the freedoms it once enjoyed.
Unfortunately, that's the case. And the silencing of media workers often goes hand in hand with pressure on legal professionals, another tactic employed by authoritarian regimes.
You elaborate on that?
Over the past decade, judges, prosecutors, and defense lawyers have been imprisoned or charged for politically motivated reasons in at least 78 countries. Russia and Belarus stand out as egregious examples. In Russia, lawyers who represented opposition figures faced criminal trials, while in Belarus, lawyers defending political prisoners were imprisoned themselves.
So not only are journalists being targeted, but even those tasked with upholding the law are facing persecution.
Exactly. It's a systematic dismantling of checks and balances that are essential for a functioning democracy.
It's a bleak picture. But is there any sign of hope amidst these alarming trends?
There are a few bright spots. One of the most remarkable developments of 2024 was the unexpected fall of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in December.
That's certainly a significant event. After more than a decade of brutal civil war, what led to his downfall?
The catalyst was actually a wave of mass protests fueled by the regime's mishandling of a devastating earthquake. Despite a brutal crackdown, the protests spread, eventually leading to key defections within the military and the collapse of the Assad regime.
It's a reminder that even the most entrenched dictatorships are not invincible.
Exactly. Syria's score improved significantly following Assad's fall, driven by the release of political prisoners and the easing of restrictions on freedom of movement and assembly. While challenges remain, this unexpected turn of events offers a glimmer of hope for a nation ravaged by conflict and repression.
It's a much-needed reminder that even in the darkest of times, change is possible. Now looking ahead, what are the key challenges likely to shape the trajectory of freedom in 2025 and beyond?
There are three key issues that demand attention. Firstly, the uncertain paths of countries transitioning from authoritarianism nations like Senegal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, where new leaders have emerged or power has shifted, hold potential for democratic progress. But their success hinges on their commitment to implementing reforms that prioritize individual freedoms and the rule of law.
So a change in leadership doesn't automatically guarantee a brighter future for freedom?
No, it takes more than that. Secondly, there's a concerning trend emerging in several democracies, including Slovakia and Mexico, where elected leaders are actively undermining institutions designed to check their power. They're targeting the media, anti-corruption bodies, and even the judiciary. If left unchecked, these actions can erode political rights and civil liberties, paving the way for democratic backsliding.
It seems like a betrayal of the very principles of democracy.
It is. And finally, violence perpetrated by non-state armed groups continues to wreak havoc in many parts of the world. From Sudan to Haiti and Honduras, these lawless forces jeopardize physical security, undermine freedom, and often serve authoritarian interests. They pose a significant challenge to traditional approaches to peace and security, demanding innovative solutions.
It sounds like a perfect storm of threats converging on freedom around the world.
Yes, and understanding these global trends requires delving deeper into specific regional dynamics. With that in mind, let's turn our attention to the promising developments in nations that have experienced significant shifts in their political landscape. These bright spots offer valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities associated with democratic transitions and provide hope amidst the prevailing global decline in freedom.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
One of the most remarkable developments of 2024 was the sudden shift in Bangladesh. It's a nation that had been mired in deepening repression under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. What led to the change?
Unlike in other countries where positive change was driven by elections, Bangladesh's transformation stemmed from a powerful wave of mass protests. In July, student-led demonstrations erupted against an unpopular quota system for government jobs. The police and security forces responded with brutal force, resulting in the tragic deaths of over 1,500 people. However, as the protests intensified, key figures within the military and police refused to participate in the crackdown, ultimately leading to Hasina's resignation and flight from the country.
Wow, a true people-powered movement. What happened next?
An interim government led by the respected economist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Muhammad Yunus was quickly established. The departure of Hasina's Awami League government eased pressure on political parties, the media, and civil society. This swift shift resulted in Bangladesh seeing one of the largest score improvements in the report, tied with Bhutan.
It sounds like there's a sense of renewed hope in Bangladesh.
There is, however, the road ahead is paved with challenges. The interim government has embarked on an ambitious reform agenda encompassing political, economic, and legal spheres. They're tackling constitutional amendments, accountability for past abuses, judicial independence, and rebuilding anti-corruption institutions.
That's a tall order for any government, let alone one in transition.
Indeed. They also face mounting pressure to hold elections, navigate religious tensions, and stabilize the economy. The complexities of Bangladesh's transition highlight the delicate balance between addressing immediate concerns and laying the groundwork for a sustainable democratic future.
It's a crucial reminder that while toppling a repressive regime is a victory, the real work of building a just and free society begins afterward.
Absolutely. Now let's shift our focus to Sri Lanka, which offers another example of a nation grappling with the complexities of democratic renewal. The newly elected president Anura Kumara Dissanayake faces the heavy burdens of addressing the country's substantial foreign debt and deep-rooted economic inequality.
It sounds like he's inherited a difficult situation.
He has constitutional reforms aimed at shifting power from the presidency to parliament are also high on the agenda. These reforms hold the potential to reinforce the positive changes already witnessed during the country's peaceful presidential and parliamentary elections.
So there's a sense of optimism, but also a recognition of the challenges ahead.
Exactly. These elections marked a significant departure from previous votes marred by violence and intimidation. A record 38 candidates contested the presidential election, which for the first time implemented regulations on campaign spending, a critical step in a nation plagued by corruption.
It seems like they're taking concrete steps to level the playing field and ensure fairer elections.
They are. But Sri Lanka's experience demonstrates the importance of addressing not only political reforms, but also economic challenges that can undermine democratic stability. The new government's ability to tackle these issues simultaneously will be critical in determining the country's long-term democratic trajectory.
So it's a two-pronged approach, strengthening democratic institutions while also tackling the root causes of instability.
Precisely. Now let's turn our attention to Senegal, a nation that successfully resisted authoritarian tendencies and upheld democratic norms. The 2024 presidential election, a testament to the resilience of democratic institutions, was held despite outgoing President Macky Sall's attempts to delay the vote and his pattern of targeting opponents.
It sounds like a real test of Senegal's democratic resolve.
It was. The Constitutional Court, bolstered by public protests, ensured the election's timely execution. The subsequent victory of opposition candidate Bassirou Diomaye Faye, just 10 days after his release from prison, signaled a triumph for democracy and paved the way for a new era of reform.
It's an inspiring example of how, even in the face of pressure, democratic institutions can prevail.
Indeed, Faye's political party further solidified its mandate by securing a majority in snap parliamentary elections, bolstering the new government's capacity to implement its reform agenda. High on the list is restoring balance among branches of government and curtailing the powers of the presidency, a crucial step given Senegal's history of presidents overstaying their terms.
So they're not just celebrating victory, they're actively working to prevent future abuses of power.
Exactly. But while political reforms are paramount, Senegal's new leadership must also confront pressing socioeconomic challenges, including high youth unemployment and the persistent underrepresentation of women in politics.
It's a reminder that building a truly inclusive and sustainable democracy requires tackling both political and socioeconomic issues.
Precisely. Now let's look at Botswana, where the October general elections witnessed a historic change marking the first defeat of the Botswana Democratic Party since the country's independence in 1966.
That's a pretty long winning streak to break.
Whoa.
What led to this shift in power?
A growing dissatisfaction with the ruling party, particularly among young voters, coupled with concerns about corruption and economic inequality, fueled support for the opposition. The peaceful transfer of power, a testament to the country's commitment to democratic principles, represented a significant milestone for democracy in Southern Africa.
It's encouraging to see peaceful transitions of power even after decades of one-party rule.
It is. But Botswana's incoming leadership faces a new set of challenges, including rising youth unemployment and declining revenues from diamond exports. Addressing these economic concerns while navigating the complexities of transitioning from decades of single-party rule will be a defining test for the new government.
So they're facing the difficult task of balancing economic stability with the demands of democratic governance.
Yes, and limiting the influence of patronage networks and enhancing transparency in public procurement processes are crucial steps towards ensuring a level playing field and fostering public trust in the new administration.
It sounds like they have their work cut out for them.
They do, but Botswana's experience demonstrates the importance of adapting to evolving political landscapes and addressing emerging challenges while upholding democratic principles. The new government's success will depend on its ability to balance economic priorities with a commitment to transparency and good governance.
These examples offer valuable lessons for nations navigating the complex path towards democratic consolidation. What are some of the key takeaways?
They underscore the importance of upholding the rule of law, ensuring accountability for past abuses, delivering tangible economic and social benefits to citizens, reforming security forces, promoting reconciliation in post-conflict or post-authoritarian settings, and strengthening checks and balances to safeguard against democratic backsliding.
It sounds like a comprehensive approach that addresses both the political and the social fabric of society.
Exactly. And these lessons are particularly relevant for countries like Guatemala and Poland, which have experienced democratic progress in recent years, but continue to grapple with the legacy of illiberal rule and the challenges of reform.
Let's delve into those examples. Guatemala, under President Bernardo Arévalo, who assumed office in January 2024 after a hard-fought victory, has made strides in combating corruption. Can you tell us more about his efforts?
Yes, Arévalo's government has filed numerous corruption complaints and established a national commission against corruption to enhance government transparency. He's also set a positive example by publicly disclosing his assets and dismissing officials for misusing state resources.
It sounds like he's taking concrete steps to clean up the system.
He is. But his reform agenda faces significant obstacles. His party holds a minority in Congress, limiting its legislative influence. Moreover, the public prosecutor's office has actively hindered anti-corruption investigations and targeted members of his party with arrests.
So it's a classic case of 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Indeed, this situation, further complicated by Arévalo's inability to remove the Attorney General, who is subject to U.S. and EU sanctions for obstructing justice, highlights the challenges of reforming entrenched systems and the need for sustained pressure to ensure accountability.
It's a reminder that even with the best intentions, dismantling corrupt networks can be a long and difficult process.
Absolutely. Now let's turn to Poland, which embarked on a path of democratic recovery after the defeat of the right-wing populist Law and Justice Party in the 2023 parliamentary elections. However, the road to reform has been bumpy.
What are some of the bumps they've encountered?
The new government, led by Prime Minister Donald Tusk, implemented changes at 3 public media outlets to counter their propagandistic use by the previous administration. While intended to restore media independence, these moves were met with resistance from President Andrzej Duda, an ally of the former ruling party, and prompted a legal review.
So the battle for control of the narrative continues.
It does. The government ultimately prevailed in the legal challenge, but their efforts to protect editorial independence and reform media regulations may face continued pushback.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act between asserting control over state media and ensuring genuine media freedom.
It is. And the upcoming 2025 presidential election holds significant implications for Poland's democratic trajectory. The outcome will determine whether reform efforts gain momentum or face further setbacks.
It seems like Poland is at a crossroads and the stakes are high.
They are. These experiences underscore the challenges of democratic renewal and the importance of sustained commitment to reform. They highlight the need to address the legacy of illiberal rule, protect independent institutions, maintain vigilance against attempts to undermine democratic norms, and foster public support for democratic principles and reforms.
It's a reminder that democracy is a constant work in progress. And even in countries with established democratic traditions, vigilance is essential.
Precisely. And as we delve deeper into the global trends outlined in the Freedom in the World 2025 report, we must confront the alarming reality of elected leaders undermining democratic institutions. This disturbing phenomenon, increasingly observed in democracies worldwide, demands immediate attention and concerted efforts to safeguard democratic values.
This sounds like a particularly insidious threat to democracy. Can you elaborate on this trend?
Yes. Elected leaders driven by a desire to consolidate power and silence dissent are increasingly targeting institutions meant to check their authority. They're going after the media, anti-corruption agencies, and even the judiciary.
It seems like a complete betrayal of the public trust.
It is. And one of the most concerning trends is the growing pressure on independent media, both in free and partly free countries. Leaders are using threats, smear campaigns, and legal harassment to hinder journalists from doing their job.
Can you give us an example of a country where this is happening?
Serbia, under President Aleksandar Vučić, provides a chilling example of how an elected leader can systematically dismantle media freedom. Since its downgrade from free to partly free in 2019, Serbia has witnessed a steady erosion of rights and liberties, particularly when it comes to the press.
What are some of the tactics being used?
Investigative journalists in Serbia have faced relentless smear campaigns, punitive tax inspections, threats from leading politicians, and even arrests.
So it's a full-court press to silence critical voices.
Exactly. The authorities have manipulated regulations and licensing processes to favor pro-government media outlets, creating an uneven playing field. And the lack of transparency in media ownership, coupled with indirect government subsidies and politicized allocation of advertising, has further tilted the scales in favor of the government's narrative.
It sounds like they're creating an echo chamber where dissent is drowned out.
They are. More recently, members of the ruling party have resorted to using strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAPPs, to intimidate independent media outlets and journalists. These lawsuits, often based on flimsy pretexts, are designed to drain resources and silence critics through legal harassment.
It's a tactic straight out of the authoritarian playbook.
It is. And this calculated manipulation of the media landscape has created an environment where positive coverage of Vučić and his party overwhelms information channels, particularly during elections. Critical voices are increasingly marginalized and silenced, creating a distorted reality that undermines democratic accountability.
It's a stark reminder of how easily even seemingly established democracies can backslide into authoritarianism.
Exactly. Serbia's experience serves as a cautionary tale of how elected leaders can exploit their power to manipulate the media and stifle dissent. This trend, if left unchecked, can have devastating consequences for democracy and the free flow of information.
It's clear that protecting press freedom is not just about safeguarding journalists, it's about protecting the very foundation of democracy.
It is. Now, beyond attacking the media, elected leaders are also increasingly undermining anti-corruption efforts, a cornerstone of democratic governance.
Why would elected leaders want to weaken anti-corruption measures? Isn't that shooting themselves in the foot?
You'd think so, but an alarming number of leaders in democracies are actively dismantling safeguards and rolling back anti-corruption laws, creating an environment of impunity that facilitates the diversion of public resources for private gain.
It sounds like a classic case of power corrupting.
It is. While corruption scandals can be shocking, their exposure and subsequent punishment in democracies usually signal that safeguards are functioning. However, when these safeguards are deliberately dismantled, it creates a breeding ground for corruption to flourish.
Can you give us an example of a country where this is happening?
Slovakia, under Prime Minister Robert Fico, stands as a stark example of this dangerous trend. In 2024, his government systematically undermined anti-corruption institutions that had previously investigated him and prosecuted his allies.
So he's essentially dismantling the very institutions designed to hold him accountable.
Exactly. Through a series of legislative changes adopted hastily and with limited public scrutiny, his government weakened protections for whistleblowers, reduced penalties for financial crimes, and abolished the Special Prosecutor's Office.
It sounds like a calculated effort to shield himself and his allies from prosecution.
It is. And these actions had an immediate and chilling effect. Prosecutors dropped charges against high-ranking officials, citing the shortened statute of limitations. Police officers investigating high-profile corruption cases were suspended despite legal whistleblower protections. And the National Crime Agency, known for its investigations into FICO, was disbanded.
So he's effectively neutered the very institutions tasked with fighting corruption.
He has. And Slovakia's experience illustrates the fragility of anti-corruption mechanisms and the ease with which they can be dismantled by those seeking to evade accountability. This trend underscores the urgent need for vigilance and robust safeguards to protect these institutions from political interference.
It's a reminder that even in democracies, the fight against corruption is never truly over.
Exactly. Now, another alarming trend we're seeing is the erosion of judicial independence, a fundamental pillar of democracy. The rule of law, which ensures that independent courts and legal professionals protect individual rights and serve as a check on political power, is increasingly under attack.
Why is judicial independence so important?
Judicial independence is crucial because it ensures that judges can make impartial decisions based on the law without fear of reprisal or political pressure. When the judiciary is compromised, it undermines the entire legal system and erodes public trust.
What are some of the tactics being used to weaken judicial independence?
Leaders have employed various tactics, including controlling the disciplinary process for judges manipulating the scope of judicial oversight and influencing court appointments. These actions undermine the judiciary's ability to function as an impartial arbiter and safeguard against abuses of power.
Can you give us an example of a country where this is happening?
In 2024, Mexico witnessed a major constitutional reform that replaced judicial appointments with direct elections, reduced the size and tenure of the Supreme Court, and replaced the Federal Judiciary Council with a new administrative body responsible for disciplinary matters. This new judicial disciplinary tribunal has broad powers to investigate, dismiss, or impeach judges, including those on the Supreme Court, and its decisions are final and not subject to appeal.
It sounds like they're giving the government a lot of control over the judiciary.
They are sassed. Legal experts have raised concerns that the popular election of tribunal members, with candidates pre-approved by the government, could compromise judicial independence. This system makes it more difficult for judges to rule against the government without fear of reprisal.
So it's a way to intimidate judges into towing the government line.
Exactly. The reform opposed by thousands of Mexican legal professionals and condemned by the UN highlights the dangers of political interference in the judicial system.
It's a reminder that even seemingly democratic reforms can be used to undermine democratic institutions.
They can. Another tactic used to weaken judicial oversight is limiting the jurisdiction of courts. In 2023, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government attempted to implement legal reforms that would have prevented the Supreme Court from using the reasonableness standard to assess government decisions.
What is the reasonableness standard?
It's a legal principle that allows courts to review government decisions to ensure they are reasonable and proportionate. In Israel, it had been used in the past to overturn government policies and block Netanyahu from making controversial appointments. The government's attempt to eliminate this form of judicial review was ultimately struck down by the Supreme Court, but it highlights the lengths to which leaders will go to control the judiciary and undermine its independence.
It sounds like a classic power struggle between the executive and judicial branches.
It is, and in India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government has similarly sought to exert greater influence over judicial appointments. They've used delaying tactics to reject nominations made by the judiciary, leading to a growing number of judicial vacancies and a backlog of cases.
So by obstructing appointments, they're effectively crippling the court system.
They are, and the Supreme Court, already burdened with a heavy caseload, now faces a critical shortage of judges, undermining its ability to effectively dispense justice and uphold the rule of law.
It's a reminder that even in countries with robust democratic traditions, judicial independence is constantly under threat.
Exactly. These concerning trends underscore the importance of checks and balances and safeguarding individual rights and liberties. By constraining those in power, including elected leaders through legislatures, independent agencies, the courts, and a free press, democratic systems ensure accountability and prevent abuses of authority.
It sounds like a delicate ecosystem where each branch of government plays a vital role in maintaining the balance of power.
It is. However, as we've seen in numerous countries, these checks and balances can be weakened over time, eroding democratic norms and increasing the risk of harmful consequences for citizens. Leaders who embrace political populism often disregard or undermine these constraints in their pursuit of radical change, posing a significant threat to democratic stability.
It's a reminder that democracy requires constant vigilance and a commitment to upholding the principles that underpin it.
Absolutely. Hashtag TTS The Deep Dive, episode 2025-02-27, part 2 of 3. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. As we continue examining the Freedom in the World 2025 report, we turn our attention to the growing influence of non-state armed actors.
These groups, ranging from militias and terrorist organizations to criminal cartels and mercenary forces, are increasingly responsible for violence and instability worldwide.
That's right. And their impact on freedom is significant.
In what way?
Well, they often operate with impunity, exploiting weak governance structures and infiltrating state institutions.
So they take advantage of the chaos.
Exactly. Their presence erodes civilian rule, cripples anti-corruption mechanisms, and undermines due process and judicial independence, further destabilizing already fragile states.
It sounds like they thrive in environments where the rule of law is weak.
Precisely. And the Sahel region of Africa offers a stark example of their devastating impact.
What's happening in the Sahel?
In 2024, mercenaries, extremist militias, and paramilitary forces played a significant role in exacerbating violence and instability across the Sahel.
So they're adding fuel to the fire.
Yes, their involvement has propped up authoritarian regimes, weakened state control, and hindered international efforts to restore peace and democratic governance.
It's a complex and volatile situation. Can you give us some specific examples?
In the Central African Republic, Russian mercenaries have supported government security forces in carrying out attacks against marginalized populations, ostensibly to suppress rebel groups.
So they're being used by the government to crack down on dissent.
That's right. And in exchange for their support, they've gained control over lucrative gold mines, highlighting the mercenary nature of these interventions.
So it's not just about ideology or power, but also about profit.
Absolutely. These mercenary forces often have financial interests intertwined with their political and military objectives. And despite their claims of combating terrorism, they've been largely ineffective.
Can you give an example?
In Mali, for example, Russian mercenaries working alongside Malian security forces suffered significant setbacks in 2024 as Islamist militant groups continued to carry out attacks.
It seems like their presence is exacerbating the problem rather than solving it.
That's often the case. Their involvement adds another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation, making it even more difficult to achieve lasting peace and stability.
And what about Niger? We discussed earlier how it transitioned from partly free to not free.
Yes, and the situation there is particularly concerning. Despite a 2023 military coup that promised to address security concerns, Niger witnessed an escalation of insurgent activity. The arrival of Russian mercenaries in April further solidified the junta's grip on power and hindered counterterrorism efforts.
It's a tragic situation for the people of Niger caught in the crossfire of these competing forces.
It is. The protracted conflicts involving non-state armed groups in the Sahel have had a devastating impact on human rights and freedoms, creating immense challenges for the international community seeking to restore peace and stability.
Sudan's ongoing civil war, which erupted in April 2023, is another example of the dire consequences of these conflicts.
Absolutely. The war between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces has triggered a catastrophic humanitarian crisis, displacing millions and resulting in tens of thousands of deaths. Both sides have engaged in shocking levels of violence, including atrocities against civilians.
It's a truly horrific situation. Are there any signs of progress towards a resolution?
Unfortunately, no international efforts to broker a ceasefire have been unsuccessful, and the effectiveness of sanctions has been limited by the continued support the Rapid Support Forces receives from external actors.
It's a stark reminder of the challenges in addressing violent conflicts involving non-state armed actors.
Indeed, these groups often operate outside the bounds of national and international law, lack formal diplomatic representation, pursue opaque or extremist agendas, and benefit from illicit economies and clandestine support from external powers. These factors make traditional conflict resolution strategies ineffective.
So what can be done to address this growing threat?
It requires innovative approaches that move beyond traditional strategies. We need to focus on addressing the root causes of instability, strengthening governance structures, promoting economic development, and fostering inclusive societies that can effectively counter the appeal of extremist ideologies and violence.
That's a tall order,
Yeah.
but it's clear that the status quo is not sustainable.
It's not. The proliferation of non-state armed groups and their growing influence pose a significant threat to democratic values and human rights worldwide. We need a comprehensive and coordinated approach to counter their destabilizing impact and build a more peaceful and just world.
Now, shifting our focus to Latin America and the Caribbean, we see another region grappling with the threat of organized crime.
Yes, this region faces a multifaceted threat encompassing direct violence perpetrated by criminal organizations, their corrosive influence on democratic institutions through corruption and co-optation, and the normalization of repressive tactics by states attempting to combat them.
It sounds like a vicious cycle.
It is.
Right.
And Haiti stands as a stark illustration of the devastating impact of criminal violence.
What's the situation in Haiti?
The escalating attacks by heavily armed gangs have plunged Haiti into chaos and severely compromised the safety of its citizens.
It's a country that's been through so much already.
It has. And this latest crisis is pushing it to the brink. Prime Minister Ariel Henry resigned amidst the escalating violence, and a transitional council has yet to establish effective control.
So there's a power vacuum.
Yes, and with numerous gangs controlling vast swaths of the capital Port-au-Prince, the situation remains dire.
And it's not just the capital that's affected, is it?
No, the violence has spread throughout the country, displacing hundreds of thousands and claiming thousands of lives. A particularly horrific incident in December, where nearly 200 people were killed in a brutal gang attack, underscores the indiscriminate nature of this crisis.
It's a truly heartbreaking situation. What about international efforts to help? Have they been successful?
Unfortunately, international efforts have faced significant obstacles. Past peacekeeping interventions have yielded mixed results, and there is a legacy of mistrust towards such interventions. Recent attempts to establish a new UN peacekeeping mission have encountered resistance, and a limited police mission led by Kenya has been hampered by insufficient funding and perceived ineffectiveness.
It's a heartbreaking situation.
Oh.
It seems like the international community is struggling to find a solution that works.
It is a complex and deeply rooted problem. While Haiti represents an extreme case of criminal violence elsewhere in Latin America, and the Caribbean criminal organizations are steadily eroding democratic institutions through more insidious means.
Can you give us some examples?
In Mexico, criminal organizations and cartels have infiltrated law enforcement agencies and corrupted government officials. They have financed political campaigns, manipulated electoral processes, and used violence to eliminate threats to their interests. The 2024 elections were marked by unprecedented levels of political violence, underscoring their growing influence.
So they're not just operating in the shadows anymore. They're actively shaping the political landscape.
That's right. And in Ecuador, organized crime has deeply entrenched itself within the political and legal systems. Investigations have revealed widespread collusion between public servants and criminal gangs, and the justice system has been largely ineffective in holding these networks accountable.
It sounds like a systemic problem that goes beyond just catching a few bad guys.
It is. And in response to this escalating violence, many leaders in the region have resorted to heavy-handed tactics that have further eroded citizens' rights and liberties.
Can you give us some examples of these tactics?
In Ecuador, President Daniel Noboa declared a state of internal armed conflict, deploying military forces and granting them expanded authority. And in Honduras, President Xiomara Castro announced a series of measures aimed at dismantling criminal organizations, including designating them as terrorist groups and implementing collective trials for gang members.
These sound like drastic measures. Are they effective?
Their effectiveness is debatable, and they raise serious concerns about human rights violations and the undermining of the rule of law. These approaches are largely inspired by the policies of El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, who has gained notoriety for his iron-fisted approach to tackling gang violence.
Bukele has been a controversial figure. What's been the impact of his policies?
While El Salvador has seen a significant drop in its official homicide rate since Bukele came to power, this apparent success has come at a steep price. The country has experienced one of the largest declines in freedom scores globally, as Bukele's policies have systematically dismantled democratic institutions and eroded fundamental rights.
So it's a trade-off between security and freedom.
It appears so. Under a state of exception, authorities in El Salvador have engaged in extrajudicial killings, imprisoned tens of thousands without due process, and purged the judiciary, replacing judges with loyalists. Bukele has also consolidated his power by manipulating electoral rules, solidifying his authoritarian grip.
It's a cautionary tale of the dangers of prioritizing security at the expense of freedom and human rights.
Exactly. While tackling criminal violence is undoubtedly crucial, it is imperative that such efforts are conducted within the framework of the rule of law and with respect for fundamental rights. El Salvador's trajectory serves as a warning against embracing authoritarian solutions to complex problems.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But it's clear that the path forward requires a delicate balance between security and freedom.
It does. And as we conclude this part of our deep dive, it's essential to remember that despite the daunting challenges we've discussed, there are also inspiring examples of resilience, resistance, and progress. We must remain hopeful and committed to the principles of democracy and human rights. Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2025-0227, part 3 of 3.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. In this final part of our look at the Freedom in the World 2025 report, we'll be shifting gears a bit, moving away from the threats to freedom and focusing on, well, a bit of a brighter note, some glimmers of hope emerging around the world. Yeah, it's been a pretty heavy conversation so far, exploring the decline of global freedom, the rise of authoritarianism, the impact of armed conflict and organized crime. It's good to end on a more positive note.
It is. And amidst all these challenges, there are these inspiring examples of resilience, resistance, and progress.
Examples that give us hope for the future.
Exactly. And one of the most remarkable developments of 2024 has to be the unexpected fall of the Assad regime in Syria.
Yeah, after more than a decade of brutal civil war, who would have thought?
It really was a testament to the power of people's movements. The regime's mishandling of that devastating earthquake, coupled with widespread discontent, it all just boiled over into these massive protests across Syria demanding change.
It worked.
It did. The Assad regime finally collapsed. It's a reminder that even the most entrenched dictatorships are not invincible.
A powerful reminder indeed. And of course, the transition to a democratic future in Syria will be long and challenging.
Absolutely. But the fall of Assad offers a glimmer of hope for a nation that's been through so much.
It does. And speaking of hope, another bright spot was the peaceful transfer of power in Botswana.
That was truly historic. The first defeat of the Botswana Democratic Party since the country's independence in 1966.
Wow, that's a long time to be in power.
It is. And the fact that the transfer of power was peaceful, it really speaks volumes about the strength of their democratic institutions and the people's commitment to peaceful political change.
It's a model for other countries in the region, for sure.
Absolutely. And it really highlights the importance of strong institutions, a vibrant civil society, and a culture of respect for democratic norms.
All essential ingredients for a healthy democracy. And then we have South Korea, where citizens successfully resisted President Yoon Suk-yeol's attempt to declare martial law.
That was a pivotal moment. The South Korean people stood up and defended their democracy. They showed the world the importance of checks and balances, a free press, and an engaged citizenry.
A real inspiration for those facing similar threats around the world.
Absolutely. Now, I know these examples don't erase the negative trends we talked about earlier.
True, but they offer hope.
They do. They remind us that the fight for freedom is far from over. And the choices we make in the coming years, the choices made by governments, international organizations, civil society individuals, they will all be crucial in shaping the future of freedom.
We all have a role to play.
We do. So what can we do as individuals to contribute to a more free and just world? Well, we can stay informed. We can support organizations working to promote democracy and human rights. We can hold our own governments accountable. And we can use our voices to speak out against injustice.
We can make our voices heard.
We can. The global decline in freedom is not inevitable. It's not a foregone conclusion. By working together, we can reverse this trend. We can create a world where all people are free to live with dignity and determine their own future.
A world where freedom thrives.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive into the Freedom in the World 2025 report, let's remember that even small actions can make a difference.
Every voice counts.
Every voice counts. Every act of solidarity with those struggling for freedom contributes to a brighter future for all.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. We hope this exploration of the state of global freedom has been informative and inspiring.
And remember, the fight for freedom is a fight worth fighting.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the Actiful Podcast.